A really long evening, and I'm going to try and keep it light. Uh, so yesterday I traveled to Hyderabad by the Rajdhani, and in our uh, cubicle there were some conversations that started as for some time I kept looking at my phone, and then I saw this old man just looking at me with a lot of disdain, like, what are these young people doing on their phones all the time? And then I looked up and made eye contact with him, and then we started to talk. And he told me that he was a retired BSNL employee, an electronics engineer. And he introduced me to his wife and said that she works in a special needs school. And then asked me, what do you do? And I said, I've come into Hyderabad for a conference, and I work with Tata. So, and they were like, oh, you work with Tata? And then the conversation just led into having a conversation about Tata. And then there was a young girl sitting there, and she started the conversation. She wove into the conversation and said, I'm from Jamshedpur, and this is what I've experienced, and this is where I come from. And then for the next 2.5 hours, we were just talking about everything from CIA to COBOL to Trump to Elon Musk to lassi in Bokaro to I don't know how time went by. And the reason I'm stating this and I'm sharing this with you is because since Shipra has called me here, I've been wondering, how do I introduce myself? Because I'm an accidental designer. I started to study design when I was 35. My graduation was in the humanities, and my first master's was in communications. And at the age of 35, I decided to go back to design school. So when I told my parents as a very young designer, as a young student, that I wanted to study design, the only thing was, what do you want to do, interior design? And I said, no. That was the only design we knew about at that point. So at 35, I went back to design school. Then I started teaching at a design school, yeah, after my master's there. So after I had this conversation yesterday, I asked myself, where does this all come together? What am I, and who am I today, and what should I be introducing myself as? So the experience on the train taught me yesterday that a lot of my work that I do, and I'll tell you what I do and how this narrative is going to flow, is that I understood that people love sharing experiences. They love talking about themselves, they love talking about, and it gives them a shape of their own identity. It allows them to relate to who they are. And somehow with that experience, they're able to reveal to us how they want to be seen, and how they want to be heard, and how they want to be experienced. And sometimes paying attention to those little details is what makes good design, yeah? So when Shipra and I were talking at the early parts, I said, listen, I'm not a user researcher, I'm a design researcher. Because for me, design is the tool I use to research. So design for me is a tool, which means that design is not a space that I think can be Puritan. I think design has to be a space that is porous. It allows for different thought processes, different methodologies, different subjects to come together to create the experience you want to for the others. And every speaker here today has pulled from different spaces, from story to number to metrics to, we are able to embrace a large, wide gamut as designers. I've also had a part of my life as an academic because I was teaching at a university. I was putting together a new age design program with Arvind Lodaya, who was on this panel as well. And some of the things we spoke about were this. And suddenly my life changed last year when I got a call from Tata saying that, hey, we're setting up something and we want a design researcher to join us. And ta-da, life happened. Okay, and now I work in the space I work in manufacturing. I'm a designer in a HR team. So essentially what I'm doing is I look at policy, I work with strategy, I work with people, I work with stories, I work with designing surveys, I work with engagement, I work with experience. So the whole world opened up, and that's where design, my lens of how I looked at design, enabled me to really be in that porous space because it's such untouched territory. And this is really where we want designers to be. This is where we want design researchers to be, to bring that skill set of design and land it into different domains, and for that domain to really look at itself differently, right? Now, it all sounds very rosy, because as a designer, I go into a space which is already preset. and I go in with my jargon, right? I have all my tools, I have all my abilities to think and make fantastic images and can put somebody from a corporate space into a little bit of a, my PPTs look very good as they call it, okay? I go through all of that. But there is some pieces that I realize that as a design researcher are, and as organizations where we can meet. And that's essentially where my talk is going to be headed towards today. Uh, so let me just lay the landscape of where I work. We are trying to set up a pioneering manufacturing unit in India. And by being pioneering, which means that we are going to be manufacturing electronics. And in that context, there is a very complex ask we've made. We want 95% of our employees to be women. Now, we're really making a paradigm shift when we do that, because in manufacturing has universally been a very male-dominated workspace. And to have 95% women coming into the workforce means that you start to look at things differently. You start to ask questions with curiosity. You start to ask questions which say, hey, do I really understand the system, or does the system require some more looking, right? So with us bringing women into the workforce, what is also going to happen is there are going to be systemic transformations within the ecosystem that we are creating as well. More empowered women, more agency, young girls with an understanding of where they want their lives to go. All of this means that we look at the way we enable this paradigm shift with the kind of systems and approaches and policies that support that dream, that pioneering dream that we have. So organizationally, this sounds fantastic, but now I'm a designer in the midst of I'm the design researcher in the midst of all of this. So what are my challenges that I'm facing, that I go through? What are these critical tensions? I don't even call them challenges anymore because I recognize that they're critical tensions in my workplace. Nuance versus delta. I was talking to some of the other people here today, and I was saying that as design researchers, we understand subtle shifts. We are given the lens to look at a subtle shift, and we are enabled to see that subtle shift as a way to understand little movements in the landscape. But then we are faced with delta, which is number-driven, matrices-driven, and somehow the subtle shift is always made very simplified in the delta form. How do you even reconcile with that as a design researcher? That was my early challenge as a person in a corporate space. It was almost like I was holding up one sad flag and saying, hey, this is not how I see it. There are really people and stories and so much more there, you know. It's not just number. There's so much more. But yeah, in an organizational setting, you kind of negotiate that conflict with what Ankur was saying. You need to recognize the need for number and metrics and measurement and all of that, right? So how do you marry these two has been a consistent kind of question that I've been asking myself. Curiosity versus confirmation, that's another challenge. Now, as a design researcher, I'm consistently curious. I love people's stories. I love listening to people. While I'm listening to somebody, I'm thinking, okay, what is this person made of? Who do you think he would like to eat? Or why is he not talking about this topic? I'm consistently asking myself how I want to map a person. I have the curiosity to ask questions. But we're working in a large-scale organization which has already seen certain methods and certain ways of thinking work. So there's also a confirmation that this will work. So you're consistently having to navigate that space of talking about how curiosity can really be a strategic asset, how it can be an asset. Uday also spoke about this morning. And like, how do you move beyond a preconception? How do you move beyond, how do you really balance that space of discovery with something that is of value to the organization? How do you see the organization seeing value in your curiosity? That's really the job of the design researcher. I don't think it's a job only of the organization, right? So we need to make that conflict, negotiate that space too. Stories versus numbers. So this has been a huge, huge learning for me. How do you integrate the qualitative with the quantitative? How do you tell that story really well? Ankur spoke about it, so I'm not going to, I think we've all learned enough from those pieces, but what I'm gathering as a design researcher is a lot of intangible information. How do I make that intangible tangible for an organization to understand? That's really the job of a design researcher. It's not a job you outsource to someone else. It's something that you learn to do, and you learn to do it either by, arguing, asking for a different way to do it, recognize the template with which you want to do it as something that's acceptable, but you really need to balance these pieces, and that's been a, and also building narratives that are driven by matrices. So many times, and I say this from a HR context because I'm not talking about a user product context. Please recognize I don't come from that context. I come from a context of people. I come from a context of real people on the shop floor, real incidences, real stories, um, where the stories are so large, so appealing, that it's always nice to tell a story and you think that will hit the mark. But sometimes the story doesn't do it. You really need to back it up with numbers and matrices. And as a design researcher, I also feel like I'm so enabled by the story. It's got the emotion, it's got the ability to really convert the other, but that really doesn't make the cut. So that's been the three big critical tensions that have emerged in this space. One being nuance versus delta, curiosity versus confirmation, and stories versus numbers. So what did I begin to do? I began to use design as a language of play and in the cultural space that I'm working in. I essentially take care of, in my current role, I take care of the culture of the organization. What does culture mean? It's such a large word, right? It could mean anything. And it is people, it is experiences, it is realities, it is perceptions, it is the sense of how I make you feel, it is how I feel in the space. It's so emotionally loaded. And but that's when I realized that there is a superpower that design researchers have that no one else has. Design is a language. It's a language which allows us to interact with so many domains, which is why I said porosity of design. The fact that we can embrace math, we can embrace statistics, we can embrace the sciences, the biology, we can embrace any of this, right? It's not Puritan. So when you do that, it becomes culturally viable in any of these domains that you can step into. And that's when you start to play with it. You start to play with it as an act of engagement. Design becomes a space through which you design engagement, you design. And also, what do you do in play? Essentially, in play, uh, you're open to failure, you're open to trying new things, you're open to going by the rules, but also giving it your best shot. And you're willing to work in a team, and a team that might have different team players who have different skill sets. So you're not like every team needs like a midfielder to a whole load of people. So when you start to engage with design as play in an organization where you're new in that space, right? Like HR is not a place where designers would think they could really even be around. You start to play with different people's capacities, capabilities, adapt to those spaces, and really see what is the end goal of that space, and that's really cultural transformation, and that's the problem you're trying to solve. So that's been a really intrinsic, and it also allowed me to look at the deep intersectional connections that design research has. It allowed me to look at how organizations themselves are so intersectional and somehow they forget it. There are people, there are aspirations, there are perceptions, there are so many things that build organizations. And as designers, we can really build so much value into that space. And somehow we've forgotten that completely. And we also have the capacity to recognize behaviors, recognize beliefs, and influence them. And I remember, Shipra, I don't know if you remember the early conversations we had where we said we are so struck by frameworks that especially in spaces which are coming from framework-ridden thinking, that we are only thinking through frameworks, but there are people, there are experiences that are real in this kind of a context. So what did I see as the future? What do I see as the future of business and design going on together, right? I really think that we should have a MBA for designers. I really think that we should be speaking the language which is a marketing, business, administrative sort of language, with designers meeting that language, and the MBA is speaking the language that the designers speak to. I think that's where the delta and the nuance piece really falls apart in some sense, because we both bring so many valuable, and I'm saying something very provocative. I really think I am. I mean, in my head I am. I can't even imagine it at points, but I think that is the consistent struggle, this uh, mattress piece and the emotional part that we bring, which is the culture piece, meeting, and how can organizations really take value from that space. That's been a thought that I've been having ever since I've joined this space of work, and asking myself, even as an accidental designer, I mean, as I'd like to call myself, or design researcher, what is the what is the space I want to occupy in this organization? What is the space I want to? What is the space that design brings as a lens to a space for it uh, to enable people, to enable experiences? It is this language that I spoke about, the language of a cultural language of understanding, of experiences, all of it coming together to create a lot of insight and detail, but marrying that with clear numbers, with recognition of how these two languages could speak. I wish design, and I really enjoyed the panel on learning, and I've been in both sides of the spectrum as an academic as well, and this is something we don't do, and we don't do enough of it. Uh, Giving our young people the opportunity to straddle both these worlds with some sort of confidence. So what would these are, and I see both of them as complementary skill sets, the ability to research and the ability to humanize, and the ability to also take the human interaction and turn it into something that is of a certain abstraction like a number. So these are thoughts that I've been having and the conversations I've been having around on a new journey. And thank you, and I'd like to have this as a discussion. This is a really short presentation, but you all have any questions, I'm willing to take them. Or anything that you want to challenge me on, I'm willing to take that too. Thanks.
Wanted to make. So MBA schools now teach design thinking, right? Um, and I think we were just having that conversation outside where we spoke about how because designers lack that tool, they are sort of subservient to the PMs.
Yes.
If we delay this anymore, what you said, PMs can do our job.
Yeah.
So it's really, really important.
Yeah. And my question, what I've been thinking of is also, should it be limited to something like design thinking? And this also comes from some sort of an academic interest that I have on how people learn, how could curriculums get better? And while we keep talking about transdisciplinarity, why is business separate of design? Because design is essentially enabling business. And why aren't we taught those skills as designers or design researchers, right? And where do both these skills meet? If they're complementary, then what does that look like? You can't dilute an entire domain like design, but what does that intersection look like? I think, what is that sweet spot? Uh, I think that's a question to be asking as well.
And it depends on like where you are, in which part of the world, and how the community is thinking. But to what you have said, I could think of like systems thinking.
Yes.
I think the conversation has to be there with systems thinking, and that comes from a lot of from applied social sciences, and that is the vocabulary that people need to talk about, because you need to know about a bit about what is machine learning, what is AI. Um, Go take classes. I mean, I'm not talking to you, but like
Yeah.
general audience as such, and see like how like small qualitative data points are translated into quant points. You
Yeah.
know, you can break a word into small points and entirely do research on that using, you know, simple codes in Python.
Yeah.
And then you can talk about like how political decisions are made in certain countries, how it is, and then that becomes a one data point in itself. So again, it's about like how you define these. So the delta versus nuance, which you were talking about, I think it is where the systems thinking comes from.
Totally.
Yeah, I am not able to summarize a lot of things there, but I think that's a word I really want our community to start using more and
More
more,
often.
so that people from different background in UX as such can be included and can, you know, contribute into.
The fact that you brought up the systems point of view, I think that's so critical. And I think more and more design researchers should use that as the, I completely agree with you on that one. Thanks for raising that.